Good morning and welcome to the final part in the mini-series on a triathlete's diet. Today is all about fat. Depending on what you know about it already, you might think of fat as this big, scary, awful thing. Or you might think of it as a wonderful, important thing that can help us massively as triathletes. Both are right. Along with explaining how fats work, I'm going to give you some triathlon specific information and include one of my favourite tips for knowing what intensity to work at to target fat use. So let's go. Well, I'm excited about this one. There's always so much discussion about fat. Give me just 4 minutes and I'll give you the lowdown on the science of fat and how it works, and then we'll move on to 3 tips for triathletes. So you might have heard of various terms thrown around regarding fat. Lipid, cholesterol, fatty acid, triglyceride, unsaturated, saturated fatty acids. It can all get a bit confusing, and fat is a huge subject, but I'm going to make it simple and keep it relevant to triathlon nutrition. So we're going to focus on the fat that we eat and that we use for fuel and how it's important to us. Just like carbohydrates and protein, there are smaller units of fat, and these are called fatty acids. Now, the most common form of fat in our diet and how we store it in our body is something called a triglyceride. You'll see it's got 3 tail-like structures, and that's where the tri comes from. These tails are the individual fatty acids, and they combine with this glycerol head to create the triglyceride. If we talk about using fat or storing it in our bodies, it's generally these triglycerides which are involved. And for the purposes of today, we're going to just call this triglyceride fat. And as a quick aside, it's the chemical bonds in those tails which determine whether a fatty acid is saturated or unsaturated. You don't need to know it in more detail than that, but it's just something to be aware of when we talk about food later on. Now, the pathway to use fat is a little bit more complicated than carbohydrate. When you first eat it, it has to be covered in some gloopy slime in your small intestines and then packaged into, well, packages. And rather than being directly absorbed into the bloodstream like a carbohydrate, it has to go through something called the lymphatic system first. All you need to know about this is that it means fats are a little bit harder and take a bit longer to digest and absorb than carbohydrates. Once fats are in our system, they can be stored in our fat cells. But in order to be used for energy, they have to be taken out and our body has to make some changes. So remember those tails I mentioned? Each wiggle of that has to be broken off and converted to be able to be used for energy. And this takes, in relative terms, a long time. So over the short term, fats aren't that useful for energy. But we have a massive storage of energy in the form of fat. It's amazing. I mentioned in the carbohydrate video that we have roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories worth of carbohydrates stored as glycogen, enough to fuel about 90 minutes of hard exercise. But fats? The average person will have between 60 and 70,000 calories worth. Ooh, that's enough for an Ironman several times over. So how do we use that properly as triathletes and to our advantage? Well, if you can answer that fully, you'll be one of the most sought after people, so get out there. But realistically, we don't know for sure. But before we dive further into that, let's just quickly run through when we actually use fat. I mentioned in my previous carbohydrate video about when we actually use carbohydrates and their link to harder exercise. If you haven't seen that yet, by the way, what are you doing here? Go and watch it and then come back. Go on, off you go. So anyway, the opposite is true of fat. Compared to carbohydrates, fat gives us less energy per molecule of oxygen. So in relative terms, we need more oxygen to get the same amount of energy from fat as we do from carbohydrates. At rest or in easy exercise, we use a mix of carbohydrates and fat. But as we work harder, our body shifts its use. We start using more carbohydrates until the point we're working so hard that we only use carbohydrate and no fat. Now, the intensity you race at will be determined by your race length. But do you see the dilemma? We've got an absurd amount of energy stored as fat, but we can't really use it exactly how we would like to. We want to race as fast as we can, but the harder we work, the less fat and more carbohydrate we use. So now we've been through the science of fat, what practical tips can I give you from a nutritional point of view as triathletes? And how was I for time today? Pretty much bang on. I know I might have gone over it a little bit with the carbohydrate video, but I've stuck to it for the last two. Train consistently and make sure you get some easy time in. The everyday triathlete can improve their ability to use fat simply by training properly and consistently. If you remember, when I said we use fat, it's less efficient, it means we have to be working at an easier intensity. So that's what we can work on. It's good for so many other reasons, but adding in slow, easy exercise into your training plan is vital for improving your fat use. Now, zones or heart rate can be tricky because everyone uses different methods to work theirs out and everyone's individual. So it's not that helpful for me to say a specific zone or heart rate to work at. But as a catch-all way to know that you're training at roughly the right intensity for improving your fat use, you need to be able to breathe in fully through your nose continuously. And this is a favourite tip of mine. We'll save the science behind it for the lactate threshold episode, which is coming up. So if you haven't already, click that subscribe button so that you get notified when I release it. But if you're not able to continuously and fully breathe in through your nose, it's likely you're working too hard. So just dial off that intensity until you're able to. And we know that the more we train, the better we get at using fat. So consistency really is important. So keep on training, but make sure you give yourself enough easy time. As a coach, I would recommend spending the majority of your time doing easy training. You'll hear different targets or methods, but roughly 80% of your training at an easy pace seems to show good results. You can improve, but you don't run yourself into the ground by smashing it every training session. Ditch any thought of eating lots of fat during a race. Although they're delicious, things like peanut butter or cheese sandwiches just shouldn't be your go-to food. And believe me, I love peanut butter, so if I could, I would go for it. But remember your fat stores, you've got more than enough, so you don't need to add to them. And you won't be able to digest it properly, so you'll increase the risk of things like diarrhea, cramps, or some other kind of stomach upset. Include a good amount of healthy fats in your diet. In order to stay as fit and healthy as possible, which will allow you to train harder and with more consistency, which will then ultimately improve your performance, you need to have fats in your diet. Healthy sources of fats are what we call nutrient dense. This means they contain loads of good nutrients which our body puts to use. And do you remember what I said about how fats are digested? They're covered in all that gloop and slime, packaged up, and then absorbed? Well, there are some vitamins that we need, handily called fat-soluble vitamins, which are packaged up with fat and absorbed that way. So without fat in your diet, you won't be able to absorb those vitamins. Now, what should we eat and how much of it? I'm aware you're probably watching this video because you've got an interest in triathlon or something similar, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But I also feel it's important, as someone who works in family medicine, as a healthcare professional and also in the nutrition world, to give you the best information available. And let's face it, there's a lot of information out there, so it can get a bit overwhelming. There's heaps of discussion as to what type of fat is best. You may have looked into this already and know a bit about saturated or unsaturated fats, but if not, that's not a problem. I'll give you some guidance on it. But if you are interested in the health side of things, let me know in the comments. I'd be more than happy to go over it in the future for you if you'd like. While the advice may change in the future, the current evidence suggests that we should aim for less saturated fat in our diet and more unsaturated fat. But if you're watching this in years to come, and if you think, what a moron, it's been shown to be good for you, and that's all old research you're talking about. Play fair, go easy on me. These are some examples of good sources of unsaturated fats. This isn't an endless list, so if you want more, just go onto Google and type in unsaturated fat examples, and there'll be loads. And these are some examples of saturated fats. As you can see, most of these are generally animal-based, meat or dairy. So do you need to avoid these? No, definitely not. If you enjoy eating them and want to continue to do so, then I'd encourage you to. But if you eat a lot of them, just consider cutting back. Or you could consider making small changes like swapping to 1% fat milk or having leaner cuts of meat. The key, like most things, is about moderation, but it is also about enjoying your food. It's not very fun for me to say, hey, make sure you have exactly 5 milliliters of olive oil with your salad, and make sure you use a chicken breast that weighs 151 grams, 200 milliliters of milk with your breakfast, and not a milliliter over, because otherwise that's too much fat and that's bad for you. It's also not very realistic. The best advice I can give you without being too specific or tailoring a meal plan for you is to simply keep in mind that moderation is your friend. The bulk of our daily food should be from whole grain carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables. Eat lots of those, and then smaller amounts of protein and fat sources. And with fat, until evidence suggests otherwise, cut back on your saturated fats and eat more unsaturated fats. I hope that made sense to you and that you found it useful. Drop me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd like me to go over. In the next video, we're going to go over what to eat before a race. I know some of you have got some races coming up, so let's get that sorted for you. And if you haven't already, give that subscribe button a big old press so that you can get notified when I release it. Have fun with your training, and I'll catch you next time. See ya!